Hey guys, Roaring Waters here, and I wanted to start a little something, a little bit of series of reviews here on YouTube, just music reviews. I want to do newer music that's as it's coming out, but I also want to start a series of, I guess you could say, classic albums in a way. I will review albums that I think are really nice, really great in their anniversaries. So like 10th anniversaries or 20th anniversaries or 30th anniversaries, 50th, 40th, 60th, whatever. But I only do it in like those segments. I'm not going to do a 12th anniversary or a 17th anniversary, even 25th anniversary. I would just go by decades because I find it's easier and less time consuming. All right, so 50 years ago today, a little known band coming straight out of London, named Pink Floyd, released their debut album called Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now this album is it's I would say it's very criminally overlooked and underrated, which is a sad thing given how like popular Pink Floyd is. I mean, their popularity has caused people to go back to look at their discography as a whole. Some people, not everybody, not everyone who listens to Dark Side of the Moon is gonna go, I wonder where those guys started from. But some people do. Some people, such as myself. Dark Side of the Moon was the first Pink Floyd album that I heard, I will admit. And as much as I loved it, I do think that I could have benefited from hearing their other stuff as well. So that led me to Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And lo and behold, I listened to it. And then I was like, oh, well, August 5th, 50th anniversary, might as well do a little review for it, tying into the blog that I have, actually, which I will link down. I have the text review. I have a couple of other reviews. I haven't really done much with it. I'm planning on doing a little bit more. Okay, so the album's a little bit of a far cry, I would say, sonically, from the other albums they will do later on. It's not as progressive. It's got a lot more of that psychedelic sound. I mean, it's still musically experimental like the rest of their stuff, but it's experimental in a different way, and given the context of the times, it was 1967, everyone was coming out, you had the Beatles, you had the Moody Blues, you had the Beach Boys, you had the Rolling Stones, the Who, everybody and their grandmother was coming out with a psychedelic album around 1966, 1967, even extended into 1968. So, given the context of the times, I don't really think that this album is particularly way out there as much as some other albums of the time were, because it's experimental and kind of weird, but it's not experimental on the level of a band like Cro-Magnon. It's not unlistenable. Doesn't reach that level of craziness, but it's also not as saccharine and sugary and poppy as the experimental side of like the Beach Boys or the Beatles or anything like that. So this album, I think, really falls somewhere halfway in between those two. It's a nice little niche, I would say. They mix the more concise, more poppy songs, that comprise, I would say, 8 out of the 11 songs on here, if you could say that, with some extended, spacey, and kind of jazzy and stuff like Interstellar Overdrive and stuff. That song is huge. So, and they pull off both sides pretty well, I would say. Alright, so the album is a 42-minute affair. It's mostly dominated by Syd Barrett, who wrote 8 of the 11 tracks and contributed to 2 of the instrumentals that the band wrote as a whole. The last song on the album, not written by Syd Barrett or the rest of the band, was helmed by Roger Waters, this song being Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk. And so it's, in retrospect, kind of funny, actually, how little Roger Waters contributed proportionately to the album, considering how much he would dominate later albums, how much he would write for Dark Side of the Moon or Animals or Wish You Were Here or The Wall and all that. So it's interesting seeing his beginnings here, writing just one song, but it's also kind of cool because you get to see he's still, not still, but he shows his signature style even this early on. The song's lyrics are, a little bit darker and moodier and different from the lyrics that Syd Barrett was writing, which were more whimsical. They were more upbeat, kind of humorous, had that weird abstract fun aspect to them. They weren't dark, they weren't cynical or anything on the level that Roger Waters could write. So it's it's really interesting. And the album was actually produced by Norman Smith, who actually not produced, he engineered all of the Beatles recordings with EMI up until 1965, up until Rubber Soul, before EMI promoted him to a producer rather than engineer. And I think this is kind of funny, actually, because the album reminds me, it's kind of reminiscent, not exactly similar 100%, but reminiscent of the Beatles post Rubber Soul material, especially Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. So I think it's kind of funny that the engineer who worked on Rubber Soul eventually became the producer for this other album. I thought that was great. And I also think it's kind of funny that at the time EMI was trying to distance the band from their roots in the underground psychedelic scene. They actually released a statement that read, "The Pink Floyd does not know what people mean by psychedelic pop and are not trying to create hallucinatory effects on their audiences." And it's great because like EMI themselves, they didn't know what kind of band they signed when they signed Pink Floyd, so they just let them have creative control, and out comes this album that's clearly very psychedelic. So it's funny the circumstances of like how people saw the band, how the record label saw the band, because they were getting a lot of tabloid press as a psychedelic band, even though Sid Barrett was the only confirmed LSD user at the time, that like was well known to be on acid. So it's kind of funny, and the album got released in the US. The date, I don't know exactly when the date was, but to coincide with the band's tour at the time, which is alright, I guess. And in terms of singles, the album didn't yield any singles for the UK release, but it did yield not a couple. It did yield one single for the US, which was Flaming, and was backed by the Gnome. And I guess, choosing the softer, more mellow, more pop songs on the album makes sense for a single, even if the songs, especially the Gnome, aren't necessarily the best songs on the album. But yeah, so that's what was happening at the time. Okay, so the album is a psychedelic rock album through and through. That's undisputable. But it does meddle with some It does meddle with some other sounds and styles, like Astronomy Don't Mind, the opener, and the two instrumentals, Power Talk H. I don't know if you're supposed to pronounce that, Power Touch or something, and Interstellar Overdrive. Those are more built on extended jams and instrumental passages that would set kind of the template for what space rock would become with bands like UFO and Hawkwind. And they have a bit of that meandering element to them, not necessarily in a bad way. It's just how the songs sound. They inject a little bit of jazz into like Power and stuff, and I thought that was really cool. I'm a jazz fan myself, and it appeals to me, when two things you like come together, it can be very nice. It can come out very poorly, but it can be very good. So jazz rock here, Pink Floyd doing it, sounds excellent. And they would later go on to explore a little bit more of this with songs like Us and Them and stuff. So I thought that's pretty cool. They also like play around with a little bit of faster rhythms on songs like, Take Thy Stethoscope and Lucifer Sam. And, in retrospect, you can look back at these and see they're driving fast rhythms and maybe even consider them proto-punk, which is pretty, ahead of its time, at least by some 9-10 years, which is pretty cool. And actually, the freak out at the end of Take Thy Stethoscope is one of my favorite moments on the album. I thought it was great. I thought it was a nice little, it's just, it's one of my favorites. And what's great about the album and like sonic textures and different styles and genres and whatnot is that the band even whips out some acoustic guitars for a couple of numbers on the song for a little bit of a psychedelic folk feel on some of the softer things like the Scarecrow, the Gnome, and even a little bit of Flaming. And it's really cool because, it adds more diversity to the sounds of the album, and it kind of grounds them by reeling in all of the experimentation, which is great in terms of like Scarecrow, the penultimate song on the album, because it does this, but it also disarms you before you get bombarded by the experimental piece of musique concrète that's Bike. Like this song might be the most experimental on the album, just in terms of the how it works technologically. It's tape music. Like the song starts innocently enough. It's just a nice little song like any other on the album, but around 22, I would say, seconds in, you start hearing these samples of random noise just edited into the song, like around the chorus, around the refrain, and it just repeats. It's a little bit of noise, and then you don't hear it again until the refrain comes back, and then you hear it again, and then about halfway through the song, which is not halfway through the song, halfway through the track. I guess the song is over at this point, around like a minute and 30 seconds or so, somewhere in that region. The song just fades and is taken over by this collage of sound, just this jumbled mess of what sounds like clocks that ring on for a while, just at different times here and there and stuff, and then just they themselves fade and just give way to this squeaking and this other noise that it itself just fades. It sounds weird. It seems weird. Musique concrète is like that. It's tape music, and you just collage it, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term. And as weird as it may sound, I dig it. I really do dig it. I think it's a cool way to end the album, especially with that weirdness. You're like, huh, that was kind of weird. Let me listen to that again, maybe. And like as an album closer, I think it's great because it fades out in the same way that Astronomy Domain fades in. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I think that's great when albums have that sort of symmetry going on. It's not really symmetrical in the rest of the album, the way that it plays, but just within the opener and the closer, it fades in and it fades out. Like, it's cool. Honestly, this is one of the best psychedelic rock records I've ever heard in my life. It's whimsical and artsy in a way and on such a level that only a 60s British band could be. The music and the lyrics on this album don't really meld, I guess you could say. They don't mesh, they don't mix the best. The lyrics are fun and whimsical, like I said, but the music is kind of eerie in a way. There's chromaticism, there's a lot of atonality in certain parts, and there's a lot of experimentation with the music. It's a running trend with the psychedelic scene, the experimental rock scene that was happening in the 60s, and I don't mind it at all. I think it's great, It plays to the powers, the strengths of the songs, and I dig it. I really do dig it. So it's a fun collection. It's a fun collection of sounds and textures that you can enjoy both casually, just as background noise, or just sitting somewhere and just listening to it, or you can enjoy it even critically. If you want to delve into the deep musicality of the album and try to pick out all the sounds, all the instruments, all the little tidbits that they do, all the production that goes into it, the engineering and the mixing. It's great for both sides of music listening, whether you're a casual listener or a critical listener. And it's honestly one of my top albums of 1967, one of my top psychedelic rock albums of all time, by extension. It's just a good record, regardless of what Pink Floyd would later go on to do. It's not my favorite Pink Floyd record, but it's still great. So it's a record that everybody who's into classic rock, who's into psychedelic rock, who's into the origins of progressive rock can and should get into. It's fantastic. It's a fun, rockin', pretty, and musically deep piece of work, as good as any other album by any band at the time could get. And it's very solid work. I give it a solid 9.5 out of 10, It's a little bit uneven on some parts, you could say. There were times when I wasn't the biggest fan, like The Gnome. It's not my favorite song. I think it's a little weak. Probably the weakest on the album, in my opinion. And so that just brings it down a little bit. It's still really excellent work. So 9.5, that's my rating. Bye. It has to be.